I've come to the conclusion that essentially I am Christian. I think that you are, even though you might deny that. I think the whole of the society, Western society that we've grown up in.
Oh, all of us are Christian now? Even those of us who are not? Truth be told, when you remove the fluff and see the frame of Holland's argument, it's comically false.
Here's why I'm almost certain that Stephen Woodford has not read the book that he is critiquing. What he presents as a quote of Dominion is not in Dominion. You know where it is? Have a look at the Wikipedia entry and look down at the bottom of this supposed quote, Dominion, Tom Holland. None of those words are in the book Dominion. Does rationality rule? Well, Rationality Rules is the name of an atheist YouTube channel run by Stephen Woodford. As a channel, it's an enjoyable watch. As a slogan, it is very demonstrably false, and we're going to see why rationality does not rule. It does not rule Stephen Woodford, it doesn't rule me, it doesn't rule you. Rationality is not that kind of a thing, and we are not those kinds of creatures, actually. And Exhibit A in why rationality does not rule is Stephen's recent video, in which he critiques Tom Holland, the historian, and completely mischaracterizes Tom Holland, completely mischaracterizes his argument, and he ends up proving Tom Holland's point and disproving the slogan of his channel.
Holland delivers a perfect narrative for Christian apologists, a sweeping historical account that positions Christianity as the heroic source of everything good in Western civilization. Consequently, it's become the go-to reference for apologists seeking intellectual validation from a seemingly neutral historian, a book that they can triumphantly point to when claiming their religion's essential role in shaping modern values.
In this video, we're going to look at how Stephen shoots at Tom Holland, how he misses Tom Holland, why he misses Tom Holland, what actually rules Stephen Woodford, and hint, it is not rationality. We'll then think about infanticide, which is the killing of unwanted babies, and why it's in fact bad. And to round all things off, we'll think about what Stephen should do about this video, what Tom Holland is doing about his argument, and what you and I can do in response. But to begin with, let's dive down into Stephen's video, How a Non-Believer Became Christianity's Favorite Historian, Tom Holland. And to begin with, Stephen gives a very helpful analysis of where Tom Holland is coming from, and you'll see instantly why it irks Stephen so much.
I've come to the conclusion that essentially I am Christian. I think that you are, even though you might deny that. I think the whole of the society, Western society that we've grown up in.
Oh, all of us are Christian now? Even those of us who are not?
If you say so.
That's quite a claim from Tom Holland, a man who, despite not being a Christian himself, and despite not being an academically trained historian himself, has somehow become the go-to historian of Christian apologetics worldwide.
Hey, wait. There was my shoulder. Did you see that? One of the videos that Stephen is clipping from is a video, probably the second video interview that I did with Tom Holland. We've got 3 on our channel. If you're interested in having a look at Tom Holland interacting with a Christian, me. So why have Christians had Tom Holland on their channel so often? Well, here is what Stephen says.
It's because he's selling exactly what they're buying. The comforting narrative that Western civilization owes everything good to Christianity.
Notice comforting narrative. We might return to that phrase comforting narrative at the end. But also notice that right out of the gate, Stephen completely mischaracterizes Tom Holland. Tom Holland, in his best-selling book, Dominion, the winner of the Times History Book of the Year, he's not saying that everything good has come from Christianity. He's saying that we have come from 20 centuries of Christianization, all the good and all the bad of it, and that the very criteria that we use by which to judge what's good and bad has also come from 20 centuries of Christianization. That's his thesis, and it is thoroughly unremarkable and non-controversial. If you don't believe me, here is Tim O'Neill, an atheist who runs the website History for Atheists. He says, I reviewed Dominion when it came out and found it interesting, provocative, and overall convincing, as did most reviewers. Holland's central premise is actually unremarkable and wholly uncontroversial, that Western culture, morality, and worldview has been profoundly influenced by the religious tradition that dominated it for the last 1700 years. It's actually unremarkable, it's wholly uncontroversial. The fact that Stephen Woodford finds it to be so controversial shows A, he doesn't know his history, and B, some very basic facts about history are disturbing him, which raises the question with me, who is believing the comforting narrative and who is being challenged by facts here. Now, Stephen does a good job of clipping together video of Tom on various podcasts describing the Dominion thesis, and I think this is a pretty good summary of where he gets to what some of the implications of his book Dominion are, which is different from actually reading the book. But here is a good summary of what Tom says when he's asked to explain the Dominion thesis.
It's so clear that the anti-slavery movement is an evangelical one. Concepts of human rights, all these kind of things, ultimately, they don't go back to Greek philosophers. They don't go back to Roman imperialism. They go back to Paul. If we want to know what an unchristian world looks like, we can, for starters, look at the Third Reich.
Christianity is the seedbed of everything that makes the West what it is. And without it, I kind of worry where we may end up.
Today, we'll be diving into the curious case of Tom Holland.
It's not really a curious case, and we will see lots of people who say exactly what Tom Holland says, be they atheist, be they anti-theist, be they agnostic, be they secular, be they people who pull on the threads of this thesis and find themselves believing. The thesis itself is unremarkable and uncontroversial, but Stephen finds it to be quite irksome. And he certainly finds it irksome when certain apologists keep on mentioning Tom Holland. He does this funny supercut of Mike Jones when Mike Jones went on to Tim Pool.
Tom Holland's book, he's an atheist dominion. Okay, so there was something moving within Christianity that Tom Holland talks about that did eventually lead to this new change in our ethics and our understanding of slavery. Christians did horrible things, but if we're going on what Tom Holland does in his book Dominion, and that's why Tom Holland says Christianity was like a depth charge. It took a while for that charge to go off and start spreading. This is what I was talking about earlier with Tom Holland talks about these Tom Holland.
Holland makes an audacious claim.
Well done to the editor. That's hilarious. And there has been a little bit of bandwagoning onto the Tom Holland train. Guilty as charged. But that's not because Tom Holland is saying anything that's strange. It's just that there is a popularity, there is a spotlight being shone onto something Tom Holland has said that Christians have been saying and that secular historians have been saying for centuries. That 1,700 years of Christianization, as Tim O'Neill has put it, has actually shaped us. And the alternative to that thesis, that is the shocking thing. That is the controversial thing. I'll put a link to Tim O'Neill's article in the show notes. It's really worth checking out. But let's continue, and we'll see not only the ways in which Stephen Woodford aims at Tom Holland, the ways in which he misses Tom Holland. Let's try and figure out why he is missing and why he is missing so egregiously. Think about that as we watch.
Western morality, values, and social norms are fundamentally products of Christianity. More controversially, he argues that concepts now considered secular or universal, secularism, liberalism, science, socialism and Marxism, revolution, feminism, and even homosexuality, are actually deeply rooted in a Christian seedbed.
Here is one of the more concerning things about Stephen Woodford's video, and there are a lot of concerning things in it. He clearly has not read this book. Very clearly. I've challenged him on it in the comments. Other people have challenged him on it in the comments. Tim O'Neill has challenged him on it several times. He has had plenty of opportunities to say, of course I've read the book. I wouldn't critique him if I hadn't read the book. But here's why I'm almost certain that Stephen Woodford has not read the book that he is critiquing. He quotes from Wikipedia. What he presents as a quote of Dominion is not in Dominion. You know where it is? Have a look at the Wikipedia entry. Secularism, liberalism, science, socialism, and Marxism, revolution, feminism, and even homosexuality are actually deeply rooted in a Christian seedbed. And look down at the bottom of this supposed quote, Dominion, Tom Holland. No, it's actually from a review of Dominion that's found its way into the Wikipedia entry, which I'm assuming is where you found it, Stephen, and put it up on a slide as though it's a quote from Dominion. None of those words are in the book Dominion by Tom Holland. This is why I'm pretty certain that Stephen has not read the book, and if he has, this is his opportunity to tell me in the comments. Please do tell me, Stephen, if you've read the book. But it's also his opportunity to say he has misrepresented the book by claiming that a quote that is nowhere found in the book is actually from Dominion. And I've got to ask the question, is rationality ruling? Is rationality ruling Stephen Woodford? Well, no, but that's not simply a dig on him. I don't think that's how human beings tick, actually, as we'll see. But let's keep going with the video.
According to Holland, Christianity's influence on Western civilization has been so comprehensive that it has come to be hidden from view.
It's true.
He argues that the religion's impact continues even when the religion itself is rejected, stating that to live in a Western country is to live in a society still utterly saturated by Christian concepts and assumptions.
So this quote from Dominion actually has the virtue of being a quote from Dominion, which is what the previous quote had claimed for itself as well. It's in the introduction to the book, which is available online, and this particular sentence has been quoted very widely online. I'm absolutely certain that that's where Stephen Woodford picked it up from. But it's a good summary of Tom's thesis. To live in a Western country is to live in a society still utterly saturated by Christian concepts and assumptions. Notice, to live in a Western country. The subtitle of this book is The Making of the Western Mind. That will be important as we proceed in the video.
But what concepts exactly? Well, human dignity, moral equality, compassion for the vulnerable, and the very idea of progress itself.
That, in essence, is what is revolutionary about Christianity, is that it shrines at the heart of the civilization of what becomes the West, the idea that there can be progress and that there should be change.
In Holland's telling, these values were revolutionary innovations of Christianity, not natural developments of human social evolution.
Yes, that is Tom Holland's thesis, but it's also the thesis of other atheists, like Joseph Henrich, for instance, the one who invented the acronym WEIRD. We in the West are Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. We are weirdos in the West, and most of the world today, and certainly most of history going back, has not privileged the individual, does not conceive of a society as based on democratic principles in the same way that Westerners do, us weirdos. And really all you need to do to kind of demonstrate Tom Holland's thesis is to do a bit of comparative anthropology, and you recognize that around the world and down through history, the things that we take to be natural and obvious and universal simply aren't. The fact that we think that they are goes to show that there's been Christianization that's happened, that's made us think of weird Western values as somehow self-evident. And Joseph Henrich's book, The Weirdest People in the World, is a great study in how it has been Christianity, and in particular the Christian sexual ethic, the marriage and family program, as he calls it, that has led to the weird values that we nevertheless want to pass off as obvious and natural and universal. This thesis is shared by historians and philosophers and evolutionary biologists and psychologists, by Christians and Jews and secular people, and it's not controversial. I don't know why Stephen is treating it like it's controversial.
So I presume it's not too hard to see why Christian apologists have embraced Holland so enthusiastically.
We quite like the truth, I guess.
Here's a seemingly respected historian with no obvious religious agenda confirming their deeply held belief.
Where's the seemingly from? I mean, he is a genuinely respected historian. We probably won't have time to get to it, but later on in Stephen's video, the only other historian that he mentions is Richard Carrier, who is his historian of choice, and he judges Tom Holland by Richard Carrier, who is a real outlier when it comes to matters of faith. He is a mythicist. He doesn't think that Jesus historically actually existed, which makes him an incredibly fringe historian. But Stephen goes to Richard Carrier to critique Tom Holland for only being a seeming historian. This is strange. This is backwards, if you ask me. But we continue.
Here's a seemingly respected historian with no obvious religious agenda confirming their deeply held belief.
Once again, that's a mischaracterization of Tom Holland's thesis. It's not that Christianity has brought about all that's good. Western civilization has been thoroughly Christianized, and for better and for worse, and there's plenty of worse. In Tom Holland's writing, we are the heirs of 20 centuries of Christianization. And this is a very warts and all telling of Christian history. And you can only say that Tom Holland's thesis is that Christianity has given us everything good by not actually reading the book. This book would give you a year's worth of material, Stephen, if you wanted to make videos about how appalling Christians have behaved down through the centuries. This book is not about Christianity having given us all things good. It's given us everything, is the thesis. Good and bad, but it's also given us the moral criteria by which we judge good and bad as well. That's the thesis. But the idea that the West has been distinctively Christianized should not be a controversial idea. Here, Stephen does a good job of cutting together Tom Holland talking about some of the distinctive contributions of Christianity into what we think of as modern Western values.
I think the concept of science, as it emerges in the 19th century, I think is entirely exclusive to Christian civilization. I think the idea that human beings are created in the image of God, that is obviously something that Christians share with Jews. But that is it gives a degree of dignity to human beings that no other cultural tradition that I'm aware of even remotely approximates to.
And for many Christians who feel their faith is increasingly marginalised in secular society, Holland's thesis is a powerful vindication. See, they can say, even non-believers acknowledge that our most cherished values come from Christianity. Hence, Holland has been featured on countless Christian podcasts.
There I am. That's my elbow. I've made it onto Rationality Rules.
His ideas are taught in Christian schools and colleges and used to buttress apologetic arguments about Christianity's cultural importance. And why wouldn't they embrace him? In a world where academic historians often challenge religious narratives, Holland offers Christians something precious: intellectual validation from a seemingly neutral source.
Now, in this video, Stephen Woodford cites 0 historians on any errors that Tom Holland makes in his history. He only goes to Richard Carrier, who complains that Tom Holland never studied history at university. Literally, that is it. The one critique from any academic historian of any stripe whatsoever is from Richard Carrier, who takes some fairly fringe views on matters relating to Christianity. And the only critique that Richard Carrier makes is that Tom Holland did not get his degrees in history.
As Richard Carrier, who actually does have a PhD in ancient history from Columbia University, put it with characteristic bluntness, Tom Holland never studied history at a tertiary level. Never. He has no formal studies in history to his credit. Now, this isn't about gatekeeping or claiming that only those with specific credentials can contribute to historical understanding. Definitely not. Many brilliant historians have emerged from outside traditional academic pathways. The issue is the profound disconnect between how Holland is presented as an elite historian delivering scholarly consensus and the reality. He's a gifted literary storyteller whose historical interpretations frequently diverge dramatically from mainstream scholarship.
Now, maybe Stephen has a whole file of academic historians and all their critiques that they've brought against Dominion. That's not in this video. So I'm only going to go by this video. And there are literally 0 academic critiques of Tom Holland in this video. There's just Stephen talking about what he doesn't like. And once again, I ask, does rationality rule?
Now, there's a lot more to say about Holland's background, and I will later. But for now, let's take a look at one of his most resonating arguments. An argument that can be effectively titled, "Everything good is Christian."
That's not his argument. His argument is, in the West, everyone has been shaped by Christianity more than they know, for better and for worse. That's a quite different thesis, and that will be important, because I think Stephen mischaracterizing Tom on this will mean that he's going to aim at this straw man over here and completely miss what Tom Holland is actually saying.
What happened? What explains the kind of evolution of thought that means that now, rather than praising the Spartans for chucking babies who may not measure up to their standards of citizenship down a ravine, we're now appalled by that? Why now do we go to such efforts to keep young children when they're born maybe on life support? You know, what explains this vast process of change? I mean, that's just one example. I've come to the conclusion that essentially I am Christian. I am not classically Greek or Roman. I am essentially Christian, and I think that you are, even though you might deny that. I think the whole of the society, Western society that we've grown up is. And I think essentially we are all goldfish, and the water in which we are swimming is Christian.
Let's pause and appreciate what's happening here. Holland is claiming that our moral revulsion to infanticide is specifically Christian, not human, not evolutionary, not a product of increasing prosperity or social development. No, it's specifically Christian.
Well, yes, I don't think Tom Holland would object to the fact that economic conditions and social conditions make the practice of infanticide more and less likely among families and in certain circumstances. But the whole-scale, society-wide revulsion at the idea of killing babies, that's what infanticide is, it's killing of unwanted babies, that society-wide censure on a practice that is pretty universal in the anthropological record, that censure, that society-wide censure together with legislation against it, that is a profoundly Christian thing. And if Stephen objects to that, he really just needs to do his history better. He could read Dominion, he could read any history and see where was it that infanticide was first outlawed? Where was it that in law you were required to raise your offspring and not to expose infants, which is the ancient term for what you would do, taking unwanted children and either drowning them in rivers or leaving them on rubbish dumps where perhaps slave traders will pick them up or brothels will pick them up or they will just die of exposure. That is a very, very common practice in the anthropological record. In the Stone Age, the estimate is that between 15 and 50% of infants were exposed in that kind of way. In the Roman world, a historian like Tacitus notes that there were a couple of Germanic tribes that don't actually practice exposure. It was remarkable to Tacitus that any tribes didn't do this thing that was incredibly common and usually targeted at girls and the disabled. And it is a matter of historical record that it's Christians who outlawed it. Constantine in 313 and then Valentinian I in 374 AD builds on Constantine's legislation to say that every parent is required to raise their own offspring and that the exposure of infants was made punishable by law. It is simply a matter of historical record that even Richard Carrier, your guy, credits to the Christians. He says that exposure was legal until Christians got sterner about it. That's how Richard Carrier describes it. Richard Carrier's article about exposure in the ancient world reads at times like an apology for it. He said that infanticide in those days was for non-viable children, the monstrously deformed who had no prospect of survival anyway, and it was morally expected. But Carrier says that is more like ethical euthanasia than brute infanticide. I don't know what the difference is between ethical euthanasia and brute infanticide. It seems like it's just the terminology. One person's brute infanticide might be another person's ethical euthanasia. But here's the point for now. Richard Carrier is the only historian that Stephen Woodford cites approvingly as an academic historian, and he himself says before Christianity there was infanticide, which Richard Carrier might like to call some kind of ethical euthanasia, and it was Christians who got sterner about it, and they are the ones who outlawed it. If Stephen is surprised by the claim that it was Christians that outlawed infanticide, that's not because the claim is surprising. That's because Stephen doesn't know the history. And once again, we ask, does rationality rule? Let's keep going.
The implication is clear. Without Christianity, we'd still be tossing imperfect babies off cliffs. It's a bold claim, and one that requires extraordinary evidence.
I know that Michael Jones and Stephen Woodford have been going back and forth about this saying that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Here's another example of where extraordinary needs to be defined. In what sense is it extraordinary to say that it's Christianity that outlawed infanticide? It might be extraordinary if your prior beliefs about Christianity is that Christianity is just the source of evil in this world. But for those shaped by the evidence, it's not an extraordinary claim at all. And you calling that claim extraordinary says nothing about the claim itself. It says something about what you're expecting from history and what you're expecting from Christianity. And again, I don't think rationality is ruling you here, Stephen.
So how does he back up this claim of Christianity uniquely introducing empathy and human dignity?
Paul, he places at the heart of his message the idea that the Messiah has come. He was nailed to a cross and suffered death as a slave. And yet this humiliating death has been experienced by Paul and by others like him as in a blinding flash of revelation that this is the beginning of a new covenant. There is no Greek or Jew, Paul says. There is no man or woman. There is no slave or free. And he founds this sense, this sublime sense of human dignity on the notion that all human beings are created in the image of God. So these are radical ideas, that the weak have a peculiar dignity, that all human beings are created equally in the image of God.
The implication here is startling. Holland is conveying that before Christianity, no one valued empathy or recognized human dignity.
He's really not saying that at all. And Stephen, you don't need to feel threatened by Tom Holland's thesis here. He's just given you a perfectly natural explanation for Christianity. Notice that. He's saying that Saul of Tarsus was converted to Paul when he had an experience of the risen Jesus. And he doesn't say that Jesus rose again from the dead, but he is saying that Paul clearly went through some kind of transformation, and he came to see that the one who was crucified in weakness was now alive by the power of the Spirit, and that he was commanded to preach the weak Lord Jesus, who has now been vindicated as Lord of the world, and out goes Christianity from that proclamation. It's an explanation of Christianity that requires nothing supernatural. It's the kind of explanation for Christianity that Tim O'Neill is very happy to own as an atheist himself. You could own this explanation for Christianity too, Stephen. You don't need to feel threatened by the fact that it's this proclamation of Christ crucified and risen that's actually transformed the way we think about empathy. And Tom Holland is not saying there's no such thing as empathy in the pre-Christian world or in the non-Christian world, but he is saying that the making of the Western mind has been a profound experience of focusing on this particular story, the crucified and risen Lord Jesus. That has grounded the way that Christians have considered empathy and dignity and moral worth and the image of God and all those sorts of things. He's not denying that pre-Christian cultures have had ideas about empathy and compassion. He's not denying that non-Christian cultures can have such ideas. But he is saying that our appreciation for weakness, for human dignity and equality, they have come from a very specific story. Other stories are available. Other foundations for virtues in other cultures are very much available. But the making of the Western mind has been this story, and I don't see why that's threatening to an atheist. It's not threatening to the Tim O'Neills of this world. Why is it threatening to Stephen? But anyway, he mischaracterizes Tom Holland to be saying that only Christ crucified and risen gives you any reason to be compassionate, which is such a straw man. It's unbelievable that he would think that Tom Holland is saying that. But nevertheless, Stephen continues.
Holland is conveying that before Christianity, no one valued empathy or recognized human dignity.
He's not.
In fact, he has to be saying this for this argument to land. But is it true?
Why does he say he has to be saying this? That is not obvious to me at all. He has to be saying that only Christ crucified and risen gives you any reason to be compassionate. I mean, it's true that the historical records says that it's Christianity that first outlawed infanticide, and that there's a uniqueness to the Christian story there. But neither Tom Holland nor Christians like me think that's the only grounds for being compassionate to anybody is the Christian story. We don't think that. But we do think that it is remarkable that this particular story has birthed such extraordinary leaps forward in terms of compassion and human equality and human dignity and that sort of thing. That it might wake you up to the remarkable and enduring roots of compassion and equality and dignity that are found in the Christian story, but we don't think that it's only found in the Christian story. And certainly Tom Holland doesn't think that it's only found in the Christian story. But anyway, Stephen goes on.
Well, consider these inconvenient facts for Holland's thesis. The concept of universal compassion existed in Buddhism over 500 years before Christianity.
Can I introduce Stephen to the subtitle of the book? I mean, he should at least read the cover of the book, okay? It's The Making of the Western Mind, and how much of the Western mind has been made by Buddhism? As a percentage, as near 0% as makes no odds, I would say.
The Buddhist metta bhavana, loving kindness meditation, explicitly cultivates universal compassion for all beings.
That's great, but can I be a little bit cheeky at this point and just point out that looking to other cultures and other religions as exemplars of compassion is a profoundly Christian thing to do, okay? So Stephen might be proving Tom Holland's thesis more than he knows. The great exemplar of compassion in the whole of the scriptures is what? Well, it's the Good Samaritan, isn't it? Jesus tells this story in Luke chapter 10 about the one who is compassion himself, and he does not pass on by when he sees the need. And even though he's from a different religion, even though he's from a different nationality, he's not with the Bible people. And yet he is this paradigmatic case of compassion, and he expends himself in the service of this poor unfortunate and lifts him up. And Jesus says, go and do likewise. Go and do like this member of another religion. It's a profoundly Christian thing to do. to point to other religions and say, there are some great examples of compassion, aren't they? Go and do likewise. Okay, it's a profoundly Christian thing, actually, what Stephen has just done there. But then he mentions Seneca. This is interesting.
Stoic philosophers like Seneca advocate universal human dignity and compassion. Seneca wrote, "Wherever there is a human being, there is an opportunity for kindness."
Tom Holland writes all about Seneca. He writes about Athens, he writes about Jerusalem before he ever gets to Galatia and starts talking about the preaching of the Apostle Paul and how it gets going. In fact, he begins his book 5 centuries BC. He's very interested in the Zoroastrians. He's very interested in the Stoics. He has no problem whatsoever with Seneca's quote there. But I would just add about Seneca, I mean, whatever he says about universal compassion, he still also believed in infanticide, which is interesting. Mad dogs we knock on the head, the fierce and savage ox we slay, unnatural progeny we destroy. We drown even children who at birth are weakly and abnormal, yet it is not anger but reason that separates the harmful from the sound. Whatever Seneca meant by universal compassion, included within that definition was infanticide, which is interesting. Remember, we're going to ask the question, is infanticide bad, actually, in a moment? But let's keep going with Stephen for a little bit.
The concept of reciprocity, treating others as you wish to be treated, appears in virtually every major ethical tradition, from Confucianism to ancient Egyptian ethics, long before Christianity.
Tom doesn't deny that, I don't deny that.
Truth be told, when you remove the fluff and see the frame of Holland's argument, it's comically false.
If you think of a celebrated public intellectual like Tom Holland as bringing a comically false arguments to bear on the world, it might be that this man who's won the Sunday Times History Book of the Year has done so with a comically false thesis. That, honestly, I mean, those things happen all the time, sure. Another hypothesis is that Stephen Woodford really is mischaracterizing Tom Holland quite profoundly and gleefully taking his flamethrower to a straw man, all the while leaving untouched Tom Holland, who is not saying anything that remarkable and nothing very controversial. Who am I to believe? And do I think that rationality is ruling Stephen Woodford? I really don't.
Now, when confronted with these facts, his response is rather, shall we say, dismissive.
Do you have to look at Japan, South Asia, Central American civilizations or do you not need to sort of look at it in terms of a kind of a laboratory testing of these ideas?
So Dan Snow on the History Hit podcast asks Tom Holland that question after Tom has laid out his thesis a lot more fully than Stephen Woodford has allowed for here. For instance, Tom Holland on Dan Snow's podcast gets into secularism as another gift of medieval Christendom to the world. That secularism is one more thing, like compassion and universal human dignity. So too, secularism is one more thing that has come to us dressed in some very Christian garb. And the ways that we think of compassion, as well as universal human dignity, as well as the secular, they all seem natural and obvious and universal to us, but that's only because they've come to us in Christian garb. And the way we think of these concepts is very particularly Western, because it's particularly Christian. Tom Holland has said all this before Dan Snow asks him that question. Hence, Tom Holland answers like this.
I think you have to test, for instance, the proposition that a notion of the saeculum, a notion of what will become the secular, is distinctive to Western Christendom, and that clearly seems to me the case.
Notice what happened here. When confronted directly about non-Western moral traditions, examples that clearly challenge his claim of empathy and dignity being uniquely Christian, Holland swiftly retreated from his bold assertion to a much safer ground of secularism.
Stephen, that's just because of how you've edited the video. You've edited out the fact that he'd already spoken about secularism, and so of course returns to secularism as a test of the thesis that perhaps other non-Western nations might have developed parallel concepts to our concepts. And so of course Tom Holland is going to mention the secular, because he had just mentioned the secular. This is not Tom Holland being slippery with his answers. This is you being slippery with the way that you've edited them. Tom Holland talks about the secular because he had been talking about the secular. He's not dodging. But then you say this, Stephen.
This is a classic Mott and Bailey fallacy, initially making a grand, provocative claim. All empathy and dignity are Christian inventions, to impress his audience, the Bailey. But the moment he's challenged, immediately falling back to a far less controversial position. Secularism emerged within the Western world, which he can defend more easily, the Mott.
Right, so Mott and Bailey is, in terms of castles, I always get this the wrong way around, but the Mott is sort of further in the defensive lines of the castle, and the Bailey is out there. And the Mott and Bailey fallacy is that you kind of make this speculative comment out here that's much harder to defend, and then when that position is attacked, you just withdraw to the Mott. And the Mott and Bailey fallacy is to say, I was always saying this very defensible thing. I was never saying that weird, controversial thing out there. So Stephen Woodford thinks that Tom Holland has been saying these outrageous things out there, and then when challenged, he just comes back to some more easily defensible positions. Whereas anybody watching that video in context would see that Tom Holland is answering the questions as asked, and he's not switching. So if Stephen Woodford thinks that Tom Holland is out here saying things that Tom Holland is not in fact saying, what is Stephen Woodford doing? He is strawmanning. He is taking his flamethrower to a straw man, and he seems to be enjoying it. But you got to ask the question, is rationality ruling here? I don't think rationality is ruling at all. And really, that's not, at the end of the day, simply a dig at Stephen Woodford. I don't think rationality rules you or me. We'll see what rules us in just a moment, but let's keep going just for now. We're not going to go through the whole video. We're just going to go through this little 5-minute portion of it.
Fortunately, his host appears to sense the rhetorical sleight of hand, and so attempts once again to pull him back onto the original question.
He's going to go to something quite a bit later in the video, just so you know.
But Holland deftly sidesteps it.
But don't we borrow ideas of democracy from ancient Athens? We borrow ideas, our morality from various sources, Christian and other sources in the East and things.
Well, like what? I mean, what are the influences in the East that have powerfully informed Western morality?
No, sorry, not Western morality, but Confucianism, right? So in China.
I don't think that Confucianism has had any influence on us.
Tom Holland is 100% correct about that. I don't think Confucianism has had any impact on the shaping of the Western mind, which is his thesis. It's the making of the Western mind. That doesn't mean Confucianists don't love their children too and aren't wonderful people too. It's just, what is the making of the Western mind? And Confucianism has not had that effect on us. Christianity has. It's really not a controversial statement to make. And fellow atheists can make it. In fact, fellow atheists make it all the time. Stephen, why can't you follow the evidence where the evidence leads? Well, because rationality does not rule you. But let's keep going.
Again, notice that Holland deflects the question entirely. The issue isn't whether Eastern philosophies introduced Western morality, though they did, particularly through trade and cultural exchange.
No footnotes to this, just an intriguing painting. Interesting.
The issue is whether empathy and human dignity are uniquely Christian concepts.
That's what you invented. That's what you invented. You invented a Bailey, and you imagined that Tom Holland was camped out in the Bailey, and now you think you've caught him in a Mott and Bailey fallacy, whereas actually we've caught you strawmanning him. Okay? That's all that's going on here.
Which they demonstrably are not. Now, perhaps the most revealing and problematic aspect of Holland's argument is the blatant double standards he applies to Christianity versus other cultural traditions. When Holland sees moral advancements occurring in the Spartan world, such as the end of practices like infanticide, he quickly and conveniently attributes these developments to Christianity.
No, he simply says that it is the Christian story that has shaped our understanding of how to treat the weak and the poor and the marginalized. It's the figure on the cross that has shaped the Western mind. And secondarily, it is interesting that it is people shaped by that story that were the ones who in fact ended infanticide and in fact outlawed it as a practice. But anyway, let's keep going.
But when moral advancements like the abolition of slavery emerge in societies that have already been deeply Christian for over a millennium, he conveniently ignores the explicit secular values and philosophies that drove such radical change, and instead insists that these too must be credited to Christianity.
He conveniently ignores? Stephen, you have conveniently ignored this book. Okay. There are lots of people who have embarked on Dominion and have thought that perhaps Tom Holland could have ignored a few more things. But actually, he's pretty thorough in his telling of history. You are the one conveniently ignoring what he says about it all throughout, and he's well aware of different philosophical traditions in the abolitionist movements. But he does say, yes, it was a profoundly Christian movement. It was a profoundly Christian movement, and that's not just a Tom Hollandism. David Bryan Davis says in Slavery and Human Progress, religion was the central concern of all the British abolitionists. If you go across the Atlantic, you can ask Robert William Fogel, who in The Rise and Fall of American Slavery said the new abolitionist movement was a crusade in several senses. It was a militant and uncompromising war against slavery. It was a holy war inspired by the deep religious convictions of its leaders, and although it did not seek recovery of Holy Land, it sought the immediate and complete recovery of the holy souls of the enslaved. You might not like how very Christian the abolitionists were, we'll disagree about that. You might dislike how long Christians took to abolish slavery, we could find agreement on that. But as a matter of historical records, those who ended slavery did so for Christian reasons. It's true that they won out against other Christians who were slaveholders. That is absolutely true. But it's a truth that is not conveniently ignored by this book, and I hope it's not conveniently ignored by the Christians that you're talking to. Nevertheless, can we just agree on the history, that the history is that Christianity had that particular effect at that particular time? Because if we can't even acknowledge the historical facts, well, does rationality rule?
The conviction that slavery is wrong emerges from a very particular climate of radical Protestantism. It's Quakers, then it's self-proclaimed evangelicals. And it's this very, very distinctive form of Protestantism that kind of just catches flame and ends up obliging Lord Castlereagh against his better judgment to go to the Congress of Vienna and to argue that slavery should be abolished.
Yet this conveniently ignores the fact that for over 1,800 years, Christian theologians like Augustine and Aquinas explicitly defended slavery, and that the practice flourished unchallenged across Christendom.
I promise you that Tom Holland does not conveniently ignore anything in his book, and if you want a warts and all history of Christianity that will do your channel much good, there's much fodder for some anti-theism in the pages of this book, so don't conveniently ignore this, because Tom Holland does not conveniently ignore the history of Christendom and slavery. But can we have a rational conversation in which historical facts are brought to bear? Because it is simply not true what you just said. You just said this, Stephen.
That the practice flourished unchallenged across Christendom.
Tell me you don't know about Christianity and slavery without telling me you don't know about Christianity and slavery. I'm not saying that Christians covered themselves in glory in any way, shape, or form, but it is simply not true to say that the practice continued unchallenged within Christendom. I highly recommend some further reading on this.
When Christianity had dominion, slavery was just fine. They only gave it up when the Enlightenment was on its way.
What? I mean, let's put the shoe on the other foot. Imagine that I said, whatever developments within the ancient world about infanticide, they only happened because the coming of the Messiah was on its way. Does that work as an argument? And if it doesn't work for me, I don't think it works for you. Enlightenment. If we were waiting for the Enlightenment to end slavery, we would still be waiting. It was a Christian movement, okay? And it was endorsed by, and there were all sorts of other co-belligerents on the Enlightenment side of things that were using very Christianized post-Christian virtues like equality and liberty and human rights. But where did such things come from? That's a big question I've got for Stephen. Where did the idea of equality and liberty and human rights come from? Like, where did the Enlightenment come from? And I do get the idea with Stephen that he kind of thinks that there were dark ages and we were all kept shackled by religion until Immanuel Kant said, let there be enlightenment, and there was enlightenment. It's a darkness to light kind of narrative. It's quite a creationist telling of history, isn't it? Tom Holland's telling of history is an entirely evolutionary telling of history. From simple beginnings, and there's just been this very gradual process of Christianization, and here we are, and we're utterly continuous with what has come before. Stephen Woodford's telling of history is creationist. It's darkness, and then 300 years ago, some Europeans got it right, you know? Some old white guys in Europe decided that we have liberty and equality and fraternity, and bang, here comes the Enlightenment, and apparently the force of that creationist movement led to abolition. It's one telling of history. I just find it quite improbable. Now, what Stephen does next is going to blow your mind. Like, have a look.
I mean, Jesus himself demands that slaves obey their masters.
Have a look at that verse on the screen. Luke chapter 12, 47 to 48. Do you know where that's from? I'm going to do a little bit of source criticism and guess that Stephen or somebody in his team Googled servant and had a look in the New Testament to try and find anything in the Gospels that mentioned servants. And they discovered, you guessed it, a parable in which Jesus is told, this is a story. He is narrating a story. And then did you hear what Stephen said over the top of it? That Jesus is commanding slaves to obey their masters, which is obviously what Paul does say in the New Testament. Like, here is this Greco-Roman reality of slavery, and here's what I'm going to tell to some slaves who happen to be a part of the church. And in the church, they have discovered freedom. They have discovered equality. They have discovered fraternity. And sorority, they have discovered liberation in the family of God. And in the family of God, there is no Lord except Christ, and we are all brothers and sisters. But as you return to the working world, you are in this very fallen state. You are in this very fallen world. And when Christians had absolutely no hope for overturning this universal called slavery, Paul says, make the best of it. But here, Stephen is putting onto Jesus the words of Paul, and then trying to associate this parable where he's telling it, like, Jesus tells all sorts of parables about all sorts of injustices. And like, what is he trying to prove with this? Does rationality rule? Or is there a comforting narrative that he's trying to tell?
It's all over the Bible. Just look at Leviticus. When the abolition movement finally emerged, it was profoundly shaped by secular Enlightenment ideals.
Tell me, give me some sources. Even if it's Richard Carrier, give me some sources.
Emphasizing individual liberty, equality, and human rights.
Yeah, but where do those things come from? This book will tell you, it'll give you an evolutionary history, a very naturalistic interpretation of how these concepts came to be in the Western mind. You're giving us a creationist narrative of from darkness to light. Tom Holland is giving us the evolution of this idea. And liberty, equality, and human rights have come from some profoundly Christian sources. And if you don't see that, well, first, perhaps do some reading around it. But secondly, just think, what is the more plausible story? Is it that some Europeans got it right about 300 years ago? Or did these ideas about liberty and equality and human rights come from somewhere? Tom Holland is telling the far more likely story, and he happens to, I think, be telling the far more historically accurate story.
Liberty, equality, and human rights, ideals that frequently stood in direct opposition to established Christian authorities and traditions. To put it plainly, Holland is playing tennis without the net.
Stephen is doing a reaction video without having read the book.
If Christianity receives automatic credit for moral advancements that happened 1,800 years after its founding, then why doesn't he credit similar advancements in non-Christian cultures?
He does. He's just not interested in non-Christian cultures. He's interested in the making of the Western mind.
Or acknowledge secular forces when they clearly drive progress within Christian contexts.
Now, there's clearly been, in the last 300 years in particular, Christian and post-Christian influences that are still having their say in the West, but none of those post-Christian influences have erupted out of nothing, ex nihilo. And even if you want to remain an atheist all your days, surely it's worth figuring out where those ideas have come from and the intellectual genealogy that has spawned them. I don't think Tom Holland's thesis needs to be a threat to you, Stephen, and yet you're reacting to it like it is a threat. Why? Maybe that's because rationality does not rule us. Let's keep going.
I mean, put it this way. Under this rubric, Christianity itself is merely a product of Judaism, and Judaism is merely a product of polytheistic Canaanite religion.
Polytheistic Canaanite religion. What's in this image of polytheistic Canaanite religion? It's child sacrifice, isn't it? We might return to infanticide before we're done in this video. But yeah, it is a good point to make. Like, if you are a thoroughgoing evolutionary thinker, then actually everything is kind of continuous with everything else. What would Tom Holland say to that? Well, I think probably the way he begins and ends Dominion is by looking at the cross. And I think he sees a level of discontinuity there with this profoundly strange doctrine of the God who is crucified as a slave to raise us up into his family. That is a profound kind of discontinuity, I think, that brings with it the Hebrew notions of humanity and God's image and all that sort of stuff. So I think he tends to do it through the cross. I would tend to do it as a Christian in different kinds of ways. It's a good question to ask, though, Stephen. It's a good question to ask. There is discontinuity. You can't simply be continuous in your thinking about these different cultures precisely because, well, look at that image on the screen. Child sacrifice is something that we think is ungodly now. Something happened to make us think that that is utterly ungodly. Tom Holland's thesis is that it's the cross, and myself, for Christian reasons, would say, yeah, that's probably right. But let's keep going.
Do we now have to say that everything is in the light of Canaanite religion? Are you sure about that? Holland also consistently fails to address an obvious question. If Christianity inherently opposes practices like misogyny and slavery, then why did explicitly Christian societies not only practice but also defend these actions for millennia? Why did the teachings of Jesus and Paul not prevent Christians from 1. Engaging in centuries of witch burning, 2. Conducting brutal inquisitions, 3. Persecuting Jews through pogroms and expulsions, 4. Launching violent crusades, 5. Maintaining strict patriarchal hierarchies, 6. Practicing and rigorously defending chattel slavery, and the list goes on and on.
You're not wrong, Stephen. The list really does go on, and by the time you get to page 575 of this paperback edition of Dominion, you'll get to the index. And honestly, I mean, just the A's in the index would give you enough fodder for your anti-theistic videos. I mean, just go for the Albigensian Crusade, for instance, or apocalypse and the ways that apocalyptic teachers have kind of stirred up violence in the name of Jesus, or just go to anti-Semitism. I learned so much about the egregious Christian history of anti-Semitism down through the years, first through this book and then chasing up some of the bibliography in this book. It's a warts and all telling, Stephen, and I commend it to you, and I apologize if Christians are just wanting to do a whitewash of those sorts of things. I don't want to do a whitewash of those sorts of things. But none of those things disprove the thesis of Tom Holland.
Holland's typical responses to these criticisms, of course, is the same as every apologist. He insists that the things that he doesn't like are distortions or failures to embody true Christian values.
Footnote that. Where does Tom Holland ever just say, oh, that's not true Christianity? Where does Tom Holland ever do that? Like, you've given us some really good clips to go by, and you're usually quite good with sources of stuff. So where does Tom Holland wave this stuff away as not truly Christian? Honestly, I can't think of anywhere that Tom remotely does anything approximating that.
True Christianity, wouldn't you know, is the one we have right now. Not the Christianity of Aquinas. No, that was totally corrupt. Not the Christianity of the future, wherein future Hollands insist that veganism is somehow a product of Judeo-Christian values. No, it's Tom's Christianity. Right now. But this reasoning is transparently circular. Positive moral developments in Christian societies are always credited directly to Christianity, while negative actions, no matter how widespread or entrenched, are dismissed as unfortunate aberrations.
I can't think of anywhere that Tom Holland does that, seriously. He clearly has some misgivings about the Christian impulse to bring everybody who is in darkness into the light of Christ, and that sense of universalism that says to the Jews, you got to become Christians, and like he sees some of the places that leads, and some of the anti-Semitism down through the ages. He sees what happens with the Albigensian Crusades and all sorts of other crusades that have happened in the name of bringing others into the light of this universal thing. Tom Holland clearly thinks that Christianity is a contingent fact of history. What he struggles to believe in is that this is the way that God wants for the entire world. And he has real misgivings about that universalizing trend within Christianity. And some of what he dislikes about humanists is that they've jettisoned the Christianity, but they're still universalizing. And they still think that other people need to be brought into the light of their own humanistic values. Tom points to lots of things within Christianity that might have had negative impacts on this world. I don't know who Stephen is critiquing here. Well, I can guess. He's probably critiquing Mike Jones, right? he probably is. Anyway.
It is tennis without the net. It's not scholarship, it's nonsense.
What he has just described as nonsense is his own caricature of some Tom Holland who's over there, and he's just flamethrowered this utter straw man over there and said that that's not scholarship. You're right. And your critiques are not scholarship either. Is rationality ruling here?
This selective attribution is not just misleading, it's intellectually dishonest.
Intellectual dishonesty. Says the guy who puts up a Wikipedia quote of the book, trying to pretend that he's read it. And nowhere do those words appear in the book that he's critiquing.
Now, there is, of course, for those that are interested, a much simpler explanation for the development of empathy and moral progress that doesn't require attributing everything to a specific religious tradition.
Okay, what is it?
Human evolution and social development. As Darwin himself noted in The Descent of Man, empathy and cooperation are naturally selected traits in social species.
So pro-social behavior is incentivized on a Darwinian frame, absolutely. But that in-group amity, you could call it compassion if you wanted to. But what's going to give you kind of an out-group amity rather than an out-group enmity? Darwin's not going to help you be the Good Samaritan. He's going to help you be compassionate within your kin group. And I don't know whether Stephen believes in group selection or not, but you know, perhaps as wide as your kin, perhaps as wide as your group, but he's not going to help you to be the Good Samaritan. Where do we get that idea of compassion from? Maybe he'll tell us.
Humans evolved as deeply social creatures whose survival depended on group cooperation. Empathy isn't a Christian innovation, it's a human universal that evolved because it enhances our collective survival.
Who's us, though, in that? Is it just my kin? Is it just my group? Who's us? The Jesus thing says you are to love your neighbor even if your neighbor is an enemy, and therefore the extension of that in-group amity is meant to be to the very fringes of the human family. Darwin won't get you there. What will get you there? I don't know. Let's have a look.
The expansion of empathy beyond immediate kin and tribe, what moral philosopher Peter Singer calls the expanding circle, correlates strongly with material conditions and information access. Not Christianity. As society becomes more prosperous, secure, and interconnected, moral concerns typically expand to include those previously excluded. This explains why moral progress often happens in parallel across different cultures facing similar material conditions, regardless of the dominant religious traditions.
So we can get the values that Christianity somewhat prizes through Darwin and through the expanding circle of compassion as taught by Peter Singer. Now, Peter Singer actually disagrees with Stephen on a couple of really important points. First of all, Peter Singer notes what should be obvious to everybody, which is that Christianity has profoundly shaped our moral sensibilities in some very particular and distinctive ways. So here he is saying it's the religious view that says if you're human, you're special. That really is a relic of the idea that you're made in the image of God, or perhaps you have an immortal soul, or maybe the animals don't count so much because we read in Genesis that God gave us dominion over the animals. Our belief in human worth and value, and the fact that you have that equal moral value because you're a human, is a profoundly and distinctively Christian thing, derived from the Bible and going all the way back to Genesis. He goes on, rejecting religion ought to make us think more deeply about some of these questions, about the questions of what we owe to non-human animals who have been so degraded by the religious tradition. So it's very clear that the religious tradition has shaped us. It's shaped us in negative ways for Peter Singer. But because we are jettisoning Christianity, so we must jettison Christian morality. And we must prize non-human animals kind of the same way that we prize human animals. And some non-human animals have a heck of a lot of rational capacity, let's say, and they can have more rational capacity than many humans. So what does that mean for human value in a post-Christian frame? Peter Singer says this. On the other hand, we have this idea that we must keep human beings alive no matter what their condition. That's a hangover from Christianity. Once you get rid of Christianity, we should not have that hangover any longer. What does that mean? Just watch what Peter Singer says.
Because I don't think that humans are special just in virtue of being a member of the species Homo sapien, I think that if you have humans who are, for example, severely damaged at birth, that it's not wrong to end their lives. So I think that in some cases, human beings don't have a right to life because they don't have the possibility of having a worthwhile and meaningful life. And so, of course, I get flack from the conservative moralists and conservative Christians from that perspective.
Being human does not grant you an inherent human dignity. You don't have an inherent human dignity for Peter Singer. Those ideas are hangovers from Christianity. Once we jettison Christianity, then of course you can have ethical euthanasia, or you might just call it brutal infanticide. And here is Peter Singer defending it on a talk show.
Let's come to what is easily the most controversial position you have defended. Infanticide, the legitimacy of infanticide, the killing of recently born infants under certain circumstances. Right. What are those circumstances?
Well, firstly, what I'm saying is that I think that in some cases where infants are born with serious disabilities, the parents and doctors together should be able to choose that the child should not live. And having made that choice, they should be able to make sure that the child then dies swiftly and humanely. And I put it that way for two reasons. Firstly, I'm not here to say, you know, this child should live and this child shouldn't. You might have two children with exactly the same disability, one with a family who wants to love and care for that child and do everything possible for it, another with a family who says, look, we think this life is, you know, starting under such poor prospects that we really think it's better that the baby not live.
So the worth of the human is in the hands of the strong to determine whether they want such a child or not. And if they don't want such a child, then that child does not have value. There's no inherent worth and dignity to the human as such. It's only if they are wanted. That's Peter Singer's ethical position, and it might strike you as quite similar to Seneca's ancient position.
And then maybe we'll have another child with better prospects. So I think it's, you know, both of those families should be able to make their choices and should be supported by the community and the government with resources to assist the child if they decide that the child should live, or permitted to end the child's life humanely if they think it's better the child should not.
Up to a certain point in time?
Well, I think it's actually hard to draw a cut-off line. That is something on which I've changed. 20 years or so ago, I wrote a book in which my co-author and I suggested a 28-day cut-off, which was based on an ancient Greek ritual that you performed 28 days after birth, when you carried the baby around the hearth of the home and you accepted the baby into the community, and after that you could no longer expose the baby on the hillside, as used to be done with disabled babies. So, you know, we thought, well, maybe that's a suitable cutoff, and that is around the time, I think, when it's starting to get a bit late, because there's usually more bonding between family and child. But I wouldn't say that you could have a rigid cutoff, really, I think.
You don't want to catch feels from your child. That might lead you to keeping them. So Peter Singer, viewed from one point of view, is saying what Tom Holland says, in that our moral sensibilities about infanticide have been shaped by Christianity. It's just that Tom Holland, like most of us, think that's probably a good thing. Peter Singer thinks it's a bad thing. But they both agree that it's Christianity that has given us the sense of the inviolable worth and dignity of every single human being, no matter their capacities. And Singer says, outside of a Christian frame, that no longer makes sense. Let's just do what the Greeks did. Let's just do what the Romans, like Seneca, did. And Richard Carrier and Peter Singer might want to call it ethical euthanasia rather than straight infanticide, but we're just arguing over terms at that point. What seems obvious is that it's the Christian lenses that enable us to see infanticide as the obviously evil thing that it is. And that just leads me to ask you, dear viewer, or you, Stephen, if you're watching, is infanticide evil or not? And I genuinely don't know how people will answer that question. Richard Carrier seems to be an apologist for ethical euthanasia. I think it is a consistent post-Christian, anti-Christian position to take. But if there's any revulsion in any viewer of this video to what Peter Singer has just laid out, I think you can pull at that thread, because I think it's Christianity that has given you that revulsion. And I think we can start to answer the question, what is it that rules? It's not rationality. It's actually, well, it's two things. There is a mythos and there is a morality that rules us far more than rationality does. Mythos and morality. The mythos is the story in which life makes sense, the frame that we put around all things in which to see things aright. The mythos, I'm not at that point saying whether the mythos is true or false. I think there's such a thing as true myth. But there is a grand narrative that frames our view of the world and which makes certain things good or bad in our appreciation. And that's where the mythos leads to the morality. And what I see in Stephen Woodford is his mythos is this creationist account of history in which for long ages the church kept us shackled and in the dark, and then somehow the Enlightenment was on the way, and out of nothing, let there be enlightenment, and there was enlightenment. And all of a sudden, no thanks to Christianity, in fact, contra to Christianity, we sort of embarked on this entirely different morality and this entirely different view of the world. I think that's the mythos that Stephen Woodford roughly shares, and it leads to certain views of morality. Peter Singer is really helpful to us because Peter Singer says, okay, if you think we really have left Christianity behind, then the morality must follow, and it mustn't be a Christian morality, and we need to rid ourselves of the vestiges of this kind of Christian overhang. And Peter Singer urging us towards infanticide can be helpful in one way. My friend Sarah Irving Stonebreaker, she went to a Peter Singer lecture at Oxford many years ago. She heard him say these sorts of things, and she said she left those lectures with a profound sense of intellectual and moral vertigo. Because Peter Singer was saying, you know what's obvious when you get rid of Christianity? It's things like infanticide. And she was like, oh my goodness, I think he might be right. I think mythos and morality kind of go together, and if I'm going to reject that mythos, then I might find myself in Peter Singer's world, and I don't think I want to be in Peter Singer's world. And she pulled at that thread, she pulled at the moral thread, and she found that actually the sensibilities that she had about equality and compassion and human value and the inherent worth of each child, that those were profoundly Christian things. She pulled on those things and she found her way to Christian faith. Tom Holland has been on a similar journey, which he said to me in that video that Stephen clipped from.
Well, I've said that I've realised that all my the kind of the liberal assumptions I had I float on faith. That without faith they have no they have no validity. So essentially, I have lost my faith as a liberal. I've lost my faith. I don't really believe in it, but in my gut I still do. I have no objective reason for thinking that anything that I thought as a liberal is true. I don't believe that human rights objectively exist or anything like that. I don't objectively think that there's anything in the arc of history that suggests that the strong won't crush the weak, that powerful states won't enslave parts of the population that they want to enslave. I mean, all of these things, and so does that open up a kind of existential abyss? Kind of, but what it also does, and I'm speaking entirely for myself here, is that because I now understand where my beliefs and values came from, that rather than just drown completely beneath a kind of despair, I can cling to stories. And I think that ultimately the power of Christianity is expressed most potently through its stories. And those stories are not just in the New Testament, but in what Christians call the Old Testament as well. And those stories don't have to be literally true. So the Exodus doesn't have to be literally true for the story itself, in my opinion, to be true. So I think that certain stories have such a power that you can surrender to them. And so essentially that's what I feel that I'm doing, is that I've surrendered to the truth of the stories, and therefore of the kind of the poetry and the mythology that they express. And I'm happy to identify myself with the truth of those stories and to see them as true in a kind of a moral, a poetic, a mythical sense. And I realised that the whole issue of whether I think they, are they literally true? Did Moses literally part the Red Sea? I've just decided I'm not worrying about that.
Yeah.
Because I think the power of those stories is sufficiently great that I can say, well, I'm going to believe in them.
Yeah.
And
I think that's the path. Yeah.
And what I've kind of felt after 4 years of fairly intensive immersion in Christian writings and studying Christian lives is that essentially the beliefs that I hold as a liberal are when I try to think, well, what the roots are, they seem anemic and uninteresting compared to the interest and the kind of the potency of the Christian mythography that gave birth to them. And I'd really rather have the poetry and the power and the myth than the kind of the pallid simulacrum, which is basically what I think I previously had.
And Tom Holland's not true whether the mythos is indeed fact or not. He says at Christmas and Easter he can kind of make himself believe, and at other times he doesn't so much believe, but that's the journey that he's on. I wonder where you are in all this. I wonder, Stephen Woodford, where are you in all this? Do you go with Peter Singer and say, let's get rid of the Christian mythos and the Christian morality? Do you want to cling on to the morality but without the mythos? Do you believe a different kind of mythos, a kind of a creationist narrative of history? And what about you if you're watching this video? Where do you think our morals have come from, and what do you think about the Christian story, about what it's all about? There's a way that you can discover the Christian story for yourself by going to 321course.com. And you can investigate life according to Jesus. It's in 8 sessions. You can binge it all in a couple of hours, or you can take your time over it. Go to 321course.com. It's entirely free. This has been a longer video, but I hope you found it fruitful. And if you have, why don't you give the video a like and share it around the place. Do subscribe to us. Tap that bell so we can see you on the next one. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.